All right. Hi, you guys. We are back with another reaction video today. This is a Teacher Things video. I have a video coming out Thursday on fat loss supplements that your favorite influencers are not telling you that they're taking. And they're natural, sort of like holistic things that you can add to your regimen if you're looking for weight loss and some support. So I have a video coming out on Thursday about that. But today, we are going to have a little teacher chat. And I was a teacher who taught during the pandemic. In fact, I transitioned careers from being a teacher in the classroom to being an assistant athletic director during the pandemic. So I have a lot of opinions, thoughts, and ideas. This is an article from the New York Times that says that what the data says about the pandemic, school closures 4 years later. And I can tell you right now, it's not good. And we didn't think it was a good idea when it was happening. And we still don't think it was a good idea. And I'm just going to read this article and talk to you a little bit about what my experience was like. And, really dive into the fact that a lot of times people are making decisions and they have no idea what it's like to be a teacher, and they have no idea the how important um, education, socialization, school is to the development. And I should even say schools, but being around your peers is to the development of students. And I think if you're a homeschool kid, then this doesn't matter, right? Because you're not on this sort of like this schedule that has to be completed in a certain amount of time. But for those students who are going to school and they took a break and then they have to go back, it was absolutely detrimental. I can tell you that. I was teaching high school when the pandemic hit. Originally, they were like, oh, it's going to be 2 weeks and you guys will be back to normal and all that. And so we were like, great, we'll just sit out for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, we were passing out Chromebooks for every single kid and pretending to do online lessons. And it was just a hot mess. So we're going to read through this article together. The more time students spent in remote instruction, the further they fell behind, and experts say extended closures did little to stop the spread of COVID. You guys know, maybe you don't know, but I was never fazed by COVID. In fact, I think I got COVID the previous year. So I think we shut down March 2020. I had gotten COVID in December of that year. My entire department was actually ill. And I remember all this stuff happened. I texted my sister because she was in the emergency rooms at that time. She was doing emergency room work, and I was like, "What's going?" I was like, "Is this really?" And she said, "Yeah, people are getting sick, but they're if you're healthy, it's not really affecting you." And I said, "Okay," and I knew that this was a crock of wallop once they had all these rules around masks and when you wear masks and when you couldn't, and not drinking water here, but then walking certain direction. And it just seemed it was like something out of a movie. It was very comical to me how they were attempting to, it was almost like they had gone too far and they were like, how do we scale this back? How do we let people back into schools knowing that, hey, we just kind of blew this out of proportion and now we say we made a mistake. So we have to come up with these crazy rules for students to be reintroduced into school. And so I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but let's get going through this article. So 4 years ago this month, schools nationwide began to shut down, igniting one of the most polarizing and hardest debates of the pandemic. It was a huge issue. It was like, you dumb Republicans and you dumb liberals. And I think we had all just used common sense. We would have said, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to keep kids out of school for like 3 months, a summer, and an entire school year. It's probably not a good idea to expect parents to teach their own children when they have never even, there was no curriculum. Because that's what was happening. And I can tell you guys, when I was teaching, there were kids who were not even paying attention. They would have their computers on, but there was no way to be like to determine whether or not they were actually paying attention. They'd be on TikTok on the computer. They would be on watching YouTube videos. They would have me muted, and it just wasn't as, they were not engaged. So even though we were in school, we just were not engaged, and kids did not really have to, um, they didn't have to have the same skills that they would have to have in a school. So, but I think one thing that happens when there's a crisis is that people forget about common sense. And when you throw common sense out of the window, you inevitably there are going to be consequences. Period. So we threw common sense out of the window, and I understand why there was a shutdown, but I think we just went too far, and then we couldn't say no. So some schools, often in Republican-led states and rural areas, reopened by fall 2020. Others, typically in large cities and states by Democrats, would not fully reopen for another year. And guess which schools are having the most trouble? A variety of data about children's academic outcomes and about the spread of COVID-19 has accumulated in the time since. Today, there is a broad acknowledgement among many public health and education experts that extended school closures did not significantly stop the spread of COVID, while the academic harms for children have been large and long lasting. Absolutely. You guys, the students who I know who were in the midst of the pandemic in their formative years, so like third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, they are immature to a different degree. The emotional intelligence, the ability to read faces, the ability to communicate, it's different. There was a marked difference between talking to students who've been in school and students who missed that little gap year. It was very apparent that they had lost the skill of communication. It was very apparent that they had also lost the resilience, right? I mean, you can argue about whether or not the structure of schools is helpful, beneficial, good, but at the end of the day, if you're going to take kids out of school and say, okay, you don't have to be in school for 6 hours a day, and then you're going to throw them back in without any sort of like, with when people were going back to work, they're still in this hybrid model. We did not go in at a hybrid level. We went full on back to school, and it was very jarring for the students because they had just spent a year not having like being able to roll out of bed and just get on their computer and get up and grab a snack if they needed to, and they could skip class if they needed to or wanted to, back into full force education. And the difference was noticeable. And this article says while poverty and other factors played a role, remote learning was a key driver of academic declines during the pandemic. So here they have this chart here that has an average drop in math scores third through grade 8. So the schools who were mostly important are only a third of a year behind, right? So if we take a school year that's about 9 months, they're only the first trimester behind. Those who went mostly remote/hybrid are a half a year behind, a little bit more. That means that they have lost critical masses of education as a result of this, especially in math. And I think it's really important that they point this out from a math perspective, because with language arts, reading, English, it's one of those things where like if you just keep reading, you can get better, right? The skill of English and writing and decoding and analyzing and writing essays is something that can be taught over time. But if you lose math, you are, for lack of a better term, kind of screwed, right? You're in a bad spot, because if you need to learn algebra and you're a half a year behind on from 8th grade math, you can't even do algebra. So the amount of kids who are probably failing because of this math statistic is astounding. I can tell you that one of the things that the teachers were talking about is how the kids didn't know anything when it came to math. So unless they were already high academic, um, already self-sufficient, self-starters, really ambitious learners, once the pandemic hit, they were behind. They were just, they can't, they were supposed to be in Algebra 1, then go to Algebra 2, and they couldn't pass Algebra 2. because it was just too much. And that's, that's something that we knew as teachers would happen. And that's why a lot of teachers advocated against this. I think a lot of the decisions that we made were driven by fear, though, the fear of the disease, right? And then just a fear of yeah, a fear of the disease, and not really looking at the long-term effects of this on students. So we can't just blame the administrators, because we voted for this too as teachers. We were like, well, we don't want to be sick. I have immunocompromised family members, and those are all valid reasons. But we just didn't, we didn't see the long-term consequences. There's a fairly good consensus that in general, as a society, we probably kept kids out of school longer than we should have. Whew. There were no easy decisions at the time. Officials had to weigh the risk of an emerging virus against the academic and mental health consequences of closing schools, and even schools that reopened quickly by the fall of 2020 have seen lasting effects. But as experts plan for the next public health emergency, a growing body of research shows that pandemic school closures came at a steep cost to students. And this is what I was looking for. Listen, this was our first pandemic of our lifetime in modern schooling. And one thing I think that we learned is, number one, we shut down schools and the kids were running around playing with each other. Okay. I remember walking out and going to the grocery store, and I would see droves of students because their parents were essential workers. Their parents had to go to work, so no one was keeping them at home, right? And they were out in droves, hanging out with each other, spreading, disease, whatever, or not spreading disease, depending on how difficult, depending on their immune systems. And so really, we didn't, like, the cost benefit was not worth it. And so I'm glad to see that as they plan for these emergencies, they understand that the consequences are dire. And one of the things that really bothered me when this was happening, when people were referring to the 1916 flu. Was it the 1916 flu? And they were like, well, those kids recovered. And I think one thing that we forget is that we are in completely different times. Completely different times. Those kids didn't have cell phones. Those kids didn't have TV and readily available like we did. So even if they missed school, they had books, and that was part of their lifestyle, was to read, right? It was part of lifestyle to be entertained by other things and things that were more academic. And I think with technology, we're already in an uphill battle with students. To give them free reign on their technology when we send them back home for a pandemic, I think that was a disaster. So I really didn't appreciate that as a teacher, how we were trying to compare that, because while I understand the sentiment, the development of those students is different. We are working with a group of students right now who do not have the same skills as the students in the 1900s. They are lacking communication, they are lacking leadership, they are lacking like just basic reading, writing, and math skills that those kids had. And because education was different back then. And so I think to compare those is a false comparison. And you are ignoring the fact that having a cell phone, having distractions, having a short attention span, those are things that we as teachers right now are fighting against. And schools help expand that, right? So when the kids went back to school from the 1900s, it wasn't as big of a gap as what we're seeing now, right? The kids that we have now can barely sit still because we have a cell phone and technology. It was really bothersome when I would hear that, because it was dismissive of the realities of what what teachers are actually experiencing with students, which is, we are working with a group of students who barely have the attention span of an ant. They have 30-second to 1-minute attention spans. And then we put them at home where their parents are working and could be on TikTok all day, and then put them back in school. and said, "You'll be all right." And that was that was completely that was a disaster. At the state level, more time spent in remote or hybrid instruction in the 2021 school year, 2020-2021 school year was associated with larger drops in test scores, according to the New York Times analysis of school closure data and results. Of course, we knew that. At the district level, the finding also holds, according to analysis of test scores from third to eighth grade in thousands of US districts led by researchers at Stanford and Harvard. In districts where schools spent most of the 2020 and 21 school year, they fell more than a half a grade behind in math on average, while districts that spent a year in person, they just lost over a third of a grade. Such losses can be hard to overcome without significant interventions. The most recent test scores from spring 2023 show that students overall are not caught up from their pandemic losses, with larger gaps remaining among students that lost the most ground to begin with. Students in districts that were remote or had the longest, at least 90% of the 2021 school year, still had almost double the ground to make up compared with students in districts that allowed students back for the most of the year. Some time in person was better than no time. As districts shifted towards an in-person learning year, as year went on, students that were offered a hybrid schedule did better on average than those in places where school was remote, but worse than those that had school fully in person. Income and family background also made a big difference. A second factor associated with academic declines during the pandemic was a community's poverty level. Comparing districts with similar remote learning policies, poorer districts had steeper losses. So I was in a district when the pandemic began. I was in a school where 80% of the kids had C's and D's. It was really, really poor academic school. And I remember when we shut down, the principals saying, we're going to get half the kids returning. So we were in an impoverished area, and we were about right. Most of the kids didn't even come back to school. And a community's poverty rate and length of school closures had a roughly equal effect on student outcomes. A professor of poverty and inequality in education at Stanford says, okay, this is what was I trying to look at? Poverty and learning was particularly harmful. Yes. What happened in our district was we were shut down for about 2 weeks without computers. And so kind of one of those weird things where we're like, oh, we'll be back. So everybody just go home. And then we get this notification that we're going to be shut for long. So the district gives everyone Chromebooks. But the district that I was in, and this is actually true for a lot of poor districts, was massive. Like we had several high schools, like several middle schools, and several elementary schools. And in fact, let me look up how big it was. Yeah, it has about 25,000 students. Okay, so they get somehow acquire Chromebooks for every student, right? And then what they told us to go through the normal day, like you guys decide when you guys are going to meet, you guys decide, how you're going to hold the kids accountable. There was no way to hold kids accountable for being in school. We were just trying to make it. And so there was really no way to guarantee that those students who were hardly coming to class anyway, actually sit at a computer. And I just remember I tried, you guys. I remember scheduling things with my students. I'd never used Google Classroom, and it was like Google Classroom. And I remember scheduling classes with my students and making videos for them. And at some point, I realized that half the kids were working on. Just half the kids. And I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And even I was just like, this is not sustainable. Some of the country's larger poor districts are in Democratic leaning cities that took a more cautious approach to the virus. Poor areas, Black and Hispanic communities also higher death rates, making families and teachers in those districts hesitant to return. We wanted to survive, said Sarah Carpenter, the executive director at Memphis, a parent advocacy group in Memphis, where schools were closed until spring 2021. But I also think, man, looking back, I wish our kids would want to much quicker. Other things that were associated with worse student outcomes included increased anxiety and depression among adults in children's lives and overall restriction of social activity in the community. And I think that's also something that we learned a hard lesson, which was that, which we should have known, social interaction is really important for people's mental health. And even though, like, I'm an introvert, so I don't care for people like that, being able to be out and about with other humans was important. It is important. And restricting that social activity and the pressure and watching your parents just sit there and everybody's gaining weight and nobody's exercising. I mean, you guys know this is our Elevate Fitness channel. I have to talk about the effect of the pandemic on, I mean, I was ordering out almost every other night because I was just like, what are we going to do here? And so I'm sure that contributed to some of the anxiety and increased depression, but we were not sure was worth it, and now we're paying the consequences. Even short closures had long-term consequences for children. While being in school was on average better for academic outcomes, it wasn't a guarantee. Some districts that opened early, like those in Cherokee County, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta, and Virginia, lost significant learning and remained behind. At the same time, many schools are seeing more anxiety and more behavioral outbursts among students. And chronic absenteeism from school has surged across demographic groups. So here's my theory on that. My theory is that when you take kids out of school for a year or a year and a half, they no longer have the habit of going to school. And there's this sort of lackadaisical approach to education and school now that there wasn't prior to the pandemic, meaning that parents are saying, well, you went a whole year without going out of school. Oh, well, I'll just why not miss a day? So there is this sort of different approach to school now. You would think that leaving school would give you an extra appreciation for it, but what it seems to have happened is that chronic absenteeism is across, and they said it's across all demographics, is that people are like, well, there's just this idea that, well, they survived during the pandemic, so they don't really need to go to school if they don't really have to, and that's contributing to this. So imagine your kid has already missed a year and a half of school, and now you have a lackadaisical approach to school because, well, they already missed, hey, we went to Hawaii during the pandemic and just had school there. We went to the Midwest. And so really, like, how important is school anyway? You can just stay home. And this article says there was almost in the COVID era a sense of we give up. We're just trying to keep body and soul together. And I think that was corrosive to the higher expectations of school. She's 100% correct. She's 100% correct. There is this, and we're still just trying to survive. I guarantee you, teachers were just trying to survive. And I think even now, the exhaustion of, oh my goodness, I've got to teach these kids who are already behind, way behind, not only just academically, but emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. And I have to catch up as a teacher and get back into this rhythm. And, we just got thrown right back into the gauntlet without any sort of grace for what had just happened, the trauma that people experienced. Perhaps the biggest question that hung over school reopenings was it safe? That was largely unknown in the spring of 2020 when schools first shut down. Experts said that had changed by the fall of 2020 when there were initial signs that children were less likely to become seriously ill. If we had just looked at the statistics, we'd have known this. Like, the fact that we were pretending like children were going to fall dead in the middle of the street was like asinine to me. It was just absolutely crazy. You guys, I was an athletic director. I was literally touching students and their sweat because, we're in the same space, right? There was wasn't like I was hugging them, but you're all in the same, you're in this enclosed area. They're touching balls, there's uniforms, there's this, there's that. Uh, and I not once got sick. Now we had some kids with COVID, but no one was seriously ill. There were a lot of kids who had the COVID. We would take the COVID test. We were administering COVID tests. Okay. We were administering them to the kids. And there were a lot of kids who tested positive who had no symptoms. And, we were watching our European counterparts just remain open and live their lives as usual while we were here preventing students from getting the education that they need and preventing them from engaging in these critical activities that really develop and shape their childhood and their adolescence. And as this article says, it did not lead to any difference. It did not lead to any slowing of the disease. None of that mattered. We could have just kept the schools open. And I mean, albeit there are teachers who were struggling with their health and they probably shouldn't have come to school, but to the degree that we could have, we should have kept schools open. Infectious disease leaders have generally agreed that school closures were not an important strategy in stemming the spread of COVID. Now, if you're someone who understands like the spiritual realm of this, you understand that this was a test, right? Like we understand that this is far beyond like just an instant, right? This is spiritual. So we do not fight against flesh and blood. It is a spiritual thing. We know that this was a test. So when there will be another sort of pandemic, there will be another, and I bet you they won't close down schools because we're testing. Okay, does this slow the spread? Does this work? If you were praying about the situation, you understood that's what was happening, and it didn't sit right in your soul anyway. So let's see. Pandemic school closures offer lessons for the future. Though the next crisis may have different particulars with different risk calculations, the consequences of closing schools are now established, experts say. Yes, because they were testing this out. They were testing it out to see what happens when we close school. It was an experiment. And I think our entire society was going through an experiment, whether it was intentional or not. We were going through an experiment that said, okay, what happens when society is shut down? What happens when we stop giving people access? How compliant will people be? What behaviors will people engage in when we tell them they can't do things? How obedient will they be to government? That's very scary to think about. How obedient will they be? What will happen to students? And they're going to track students over time now from the pandemic until their adulthood and say, well, what happened then? And that's just the insidious satanic culture that we live in. In the future, infectious disease experts said they hope decisions will be guided more by epidemiological data as it emerged, taking into account the trade-off. Could we have used better data to guide our decision making? Yes, said Dr. Uzma Hassan, Division of Chief Pediatrics Infectious Diseases. Fear should not guide our decision making. And that was the entire premise of the pandemic. And I think it was interesting is I'm also seeing. It was interesting because fear drove these decisions. Fear still very much drives a lot of what we do in the classroom today. There's this, they created a society that was anxious, a society that said, well, if I can just figure out where I got sick, then I can stop this disease. The the hubris to think that you are so godlike that you can actually determine where a disease started and stop it. Like to me, it was comical because I'm like, wait a minute, you can pretend like you can actually determine when the disease started and stopped. And then you're going to say, well, if you walk in this direction, okay, that's what I told you guys I was going to tell you. So one of the things that was crazy during the pandemic where I started to know, I was like, this is a sick joke, we had arrows in our hallway because apparently COVID could only make right turns. So we had arrows going one way, and kids had to make sure that they all exited a certain way and came in a different way, as if like diseases don't cross lines. Or if diseases can't go backwards. So students would walk in a line one direction if they were going a certain, if they were leaving, and then if they were entering, they'd come in another way in a line. And I was like, this is like, if there were aliens watching, they would probably think this is hilarious. Like, look at these humans like just following these weird guidelines. Another one that was crazy, and I told people this before, that like we would be outdoors. I remember one of the parameters was that if you could be outdoors without a mask on, within 6 feet of people, right? That was like one of the parameters. So we had kids playing field hockey and soccer or whatever, and they could play field hockey on the field without a mask on. But once they got to the bench, they had to put their mask on. Same thing with basketball. And I was like, wait a minute, you guys just like make this up to see how dumb we are? You know, did you guys just make this up so that you guys could see how much people would comply? The answer is yes. Like absolutely the answer is yes. It was crazy. And I think, I look back on it and I'm laughing now, but I was stressed out. As a teacher, I was so stressed about making sure that everybody was in compliance. We were like, okay, like they have to walk this way, and we have to make sure everybody's tested, and we have to make sure, no parents could watch their kids play games. And, it was extremely stressful on adults. I can only imagine students. And we had parents who were just absolutely livid. I mean, they pulled their kids out of school because they wanted their kids to go to a school that was having full instruction. And I totally understand. And now we're looking at those schools, and it was the right decision. It was the right decision. So, yeah, if you guys were teaching during the pandemic, you can leave your comments below. I'm glad. What I'm really thankful for is that people are realizing it was a mistake, because that's all I think teachers wanted too, because a lot of teachers knew inherently, we were like innately, we knew this was an error, but we didn't want to go against the experts, right? Who are like these doctors or nurses who have zero clue about what goes on in a classroom, or the benefits of, students being in school, if they're already there. And we knew this, but we didn't feel qualified to see this. And there was so much rhetoric around, oh, you're a conservative or you're a Republican if you think kids should be in school. And we're just like, no, like actually this is just common sense. If kids are not affected by this disease, then they should be in school. And we were thinking, a lot were thinking about the long-term consequences of, of what would happen. And as a teacher, that's something that you can, you have foresight, right? Parents were not thinking about this. They were, as soon as those kids came in, they were ready to send them back. So yeah, it was just it was an experiment that we learned a lot from. And the great news is that there's a general consensus that is on both sides of the aisle. I think everyone is realizing, okay, we messed up. We will never close schools in this fashion again. And at the very least, we will, if we do close schools, we'll anticipate the consequences and be able to provide support coming back. Because I think that was the biggest thing, is the support was missing when the students came back to school. And there was just nothing we could really do about it. So anyway, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was fun reading the article. I wanted to do an article about why boys aren't excelling in school. But I think I'll say that for another day. Because this is getting late and I have to go to bed. But anyway, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will chat with you guys later if you were teaching during the pandemic. and you thought this was insightful or helpful, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.